Okay, continue the book of Revelation. I was going to talk about kind of some things I've been thinking about in the book of Acts that I've covered earlier that I've now discovered that I could add on to, but I want to try to keep this momentum going in Revelation. Now, also, one more preliminary comment before we get into it here is that sometimes in Southern Baptist circles, you get used to points of application in preaching and teaching, okay? That's fine. But sometimes some of that's kind of forced. And we get used to hearing sort of a point of application whenever we go to the Bible. Now, look, we know that the scriptures are good for teaching and reproof and all those kind of things. That's fine. But sometimes you just want to kind of let the text be what it is. And the book of Revelation, that is probably more often a good idea than one might expect. In fact, if you spend too much time trying to make points of application in the book of Revelation, you might find yourself in a little bit of trouble. You might misinterpret a few things. So I'm going to go over it. We're going to have to zanify this. You can't do this without being zany. So let's get the zany professor in here. All right, we're ready to go now. Actually, this is a really tough passage, I won't lie. Okay, so this is chapter 4. It says, after this, so what does he mean by after this? Because this is where I'm talking about, where the time frames, the imagery, what's a vision, what's the future, you know. These letters go to the churches, and he says, after this. So what does that mean? You know, in the commentaries I've been reading didn't really almost even address this. It's just sort of like, I guess they're assuming he means after what he was given to give to the churches, which is probably true. But then I've always wondered in this passage, well, maybe it means after these things come to pass about the subjects of which he's written. Anyway, we'll see. So after this I looked, and behold, a door standing open in heaven. And the first voice, which I heard speaking to me like a trumpet, said, come up here, and I will show you what must take place after this. So it seemed might be a little bit of both, right? It could be what he saw after he saw what he had to write to the churches, but it's also what's going to have to happen with the churches. So it does lend credence to this idea that the 7 churches might represent the whole church. Again, with all of this, you can't just say, well, that's it. Right? Even if it sounds like it's the key that unlocks everything. It just doesn't always work that way. All right, verse 2. At once I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne stood in heaven, and one seated on the throne. And he who sat there had the appearance of jasper and chameleon, and around the throne was a rainbow that had the appearance of an emerald. And this, harkens back to the idea of deity being hidden. And I know that's strange, but that's kind of what's happening here. And some of the jewels that are mentioned here might represent Israel, or at least the tribes of Israel. And then we get into a really controversial area, okay? So I'm going to give you the simplistic answer and then the complex answer. Around the throne were 24 thrones. And seated on the thrones were 24 elders, clothed in white garments with golden crowns on their heads. Okay, now this is where it gets kind of tough to interpret. Okay, well, we know a lot's going to be tough to interpret here. But this will be one of the first areas where I'm not going to be able to settle on anything too hard. The first is that this could be angels. And I think that's the classical understanding of this. They're robed in white. They're in the throne room of God. This could be taking place now. You see what I'm saying? So it's reasonable that people would think that this is the throne room of God and therefore angels. But then when you get to the end of Book of Revelation, you see the New Jerusalem. And what are the foundations of the New Jerusalem built on? Well, it's built on the 12 tribes of Israel and the 12 apostles. So you get the idea that maybe this represents all of Christendom, that they represent this. It's possible. That is possible. Then I saw a really interesting thing about emperors at this time. where it says they had lictorns and they carried out the orders of the emperor, including capital punishment. And at some point, under Domitian, what was his name? I forget his name. He had 24 of these, and that's what this could be. All right, so look, there's a lot more that could be said about that, and I have limited time, unfortunately, but consider all three of those. Now listen to this. This is really good. Verse 5. From the throne came flashes of lightning and rumblings and peals of thunder. And so what does that remind you of? Well, it reminds you of Mount Sinai. That's the first thing you think about when you see this. And I think he wants you to think of that. He wants you to think of Mount Sinai. And what happened at Mount Sinai? Right? God sent Moses down with the 10 Commandments and brought judgment on Israel for worshiping false gods and so forth. So from the throne came flashes of lightning and rumblings and peals of thunder, and before the throne were burning 7 torches of fire. So this may represent the Holy Spirit. And what's that? That makes you think of the elixir fire above the apostles' heads. So contextually, you might be able to make a case that it's the apostles and the 12 tribes of Israel represented by the elders, just looking at the context. Again, remember what I said. You don't want to take context too far. It's a tool. You don't want to say, oh, well, that's context, that's it. It doesn't quite work that way. Context is helpful, absolutely. And it may even be the sort of the piece of weight that drives this into us understanding this as the 12 tribes and the 12 apostles. But maybe not. So there's more to study here. And then we're only going to do the first part of verse 6 to sort of wrap this up. Verse 6, it says, and before the throne there was, as it were, a sea of glass like crystal. Now this was one of the first images of the book of Revelation that really struck me. And when I studied it, fascinated me the most. And the idea is that this represents the sea. And I talked about this earlier when we were in the book of Revelation, and notice where it's located. It's at God's feet. And it's a place where you would have to cross to get to the throne. So this idea that, and what's the deal with the sea? Well, the sea is a place of danger and chaos. And so the idea of Jesus walking on the sea, all of this idea of God controlling the sea, is a really big deal. So this is the idea, we're seeing a vision where God is in complete control and in the throne room of heaven, and this is something that either presently or in the future is coming to pass. So we could sit here and make a lot of points of application, right? Tons. But I'm not going to do that. And the reason why I'm not going to do that isn't that a preacher shouldn't be doing that, but rather I would rather spend a lot more time doing a deep analysis and study. And with only 8 to 10 minutes to do this, there just isn't enough time to really do all that. But there certainly is a lot that's interesting to consider.